Are you ready to hear the story of Flamma, the fearless Roman gladiator who turned down his freedom 4 times and chose to keep fighting until the bitter end? From his mysterious origins to his impressive track record of victories and draws, Flamma's tale will have you on the edge of your seat. Flamma was a famous Roman gladiator who lived in the 1st century AD during the reign of the Emperor Hadrian. His life and achievements are neatly summarized on a faded gravestone which still survives in Sicily. Lived 30 years, fought 34 times, won 21 times, stood to draw 9 times, won a reprieve 4 times, of Syrian extraction. Life was cheap in ancient Rome, and perhaps the best-known example of this were the Gladiatorial Games, where armed men would be pitted against each other in a fight to the death for the entertainment of a baying crowd. In reality, things were a little more complex and not always as barbaric as modern movies lead us to believe. While no one is completely sure of their origins, it is likely that the first gladiators emerged from funeral rites around 300 BCE. The Roman historian Livy describes 3 gladiator pairs fighting to the death in the cattle market to mark the funeral of Decimus Junius Brutus. He describes this as amunuses, or gift offered to the ancestors of the deceased. Animal sacrifice was a common practice in the ancient world, and we can perhaps see this as an extension of that idea. But it also served another purpose. It was a display of opulence, a spectacle to remind assembled guests of the wealth and power of the family that had paid for it. The practice caught on and expanded over the next century or so. In 216 BCE, the death of consul Marcus Aemilius Lepidus was honored with 22 gladiator pairs in the Forum. In 183 BCE, Publius Licinius's funeral was marked by 3 days of festivities which involved 120 gladiators and the public distribution of meat. The men fighting in these bouts do not seem to have been slaves or prisoners of war. Some may have been high-status non-Romans or perhaps even Roman citizens willing to risk their lives and display their military prowess for a hefty fee. But things soon began to change, and gladiatorial games were brought from private funerals into public state-sponsored events. In 105 BCE, the Roman consuls put on a display of barbarian fighters from Capua, which proved immensely popular. Thereafter, gladiators became a common feature of the ludi or state games that accompanied religious festivals. No longer just a display of wealth, gladiatorial games soon came to be a means of winning and maintaining political power. The Roman crowd were fickle, and as the poet Juvenal famously remarked, could be easily won over by bread and circuses. The owning and training of gladiators became big business as many leading aristocrats and officials vied to outdo each other with the fights they sponsored. In 65 BC, Julius Caesar, although massively in debt, put on an unprecedentedly extravagant display of 320 gladiators in silvered armor. This was presented as amunuses to honor his father, despite the fact he had died some 20 years before. By the 1st century, gladiatorial games were a common feature across the empire, and it was in this period that the legendary Flamma emerged. The word gladiator comes from the Latin gladius's meaning a short sword commonly carried by Roman foot soldiers. But in reality, they used a variety of weapons. Flamma fought as a secutor, a class of gladiator armed with a heavy shield and short sword, and would have been pitted against Aretiarius's armed with a trident and net. Secutors, meaning followers or chasers, wore armor down their right arm and a heavy helmet with narrow eye holes to avoid the thrusts of the trident. Their aim was to end the fight quickly since they were prone to exhaustion in longer bouts against their lightly armored opponents. And Flamma must have been a man of considerable skill, strength, and stamina to have lasted as long as he did. His origins are unknown, but he was probably either a Jewish Syrian rebel or a disgraced Roman auxiliary sold into slavery. There were several Jewish revolts in Judea and Syria at the time, and many captured revolutionaries would have been sent to gladiator schools and ultimately the arena. Flamma would have been 17 at the end of the Bar Kokhba uprising, which ravaged the region for 4 years. 6 legions were sent to quash the rebellion, resulting in the deaths of 600,000 Jews and the destruction of over 900 villages. Flamma may also have been a Syrian auxiliary recruited into the Roman army who refused to take part in the violence against his own people. Or he may simply have been an innocent bystander swept up in the conflict and sent to Rome as a trophy of war. Whatever his true beginnings, he would go on to have a long and illustrious career. They say beware an old man in a profession where men usually die young, and nowhere can this have been more apt than for Roman gladiators. Average life expectancy was a mere 25 years at the time, but for professional fighters, survival was a constant lottery. Flamma may well have begun his career as a gregari, prisoner prisoners of war who were grouped together to fight to the death for the amusement of the crowd. If he managed to emerge from this carnage victorious, he would have been showered with praise and then trained as a secutor. Gladiators were mostly men, although there are some rare examples of women in the arena. These were usually presented as an exotic novelty. In 66 AD, Nero had Ethiopian women and even children fight, and in 89 AD, there is record of a number of female gladiators described as Amazons. For the most part, though, gladiators were a brotherhood who lived and trained together, even sometimes paying for each other's funerals. Once Flamma had been chosen, he would have been sent to a ludus or training school to learn his craft. Successful gladiators were the rock stars of their age, and Flamma's 21 victories would have certainly gained him a loyal fan base. On the 4 occasions that he won a reprieve, this would have been down to his fame, courage, and charisma. While the 9 fights that ended in a draw may seem odd, it was not unusual for experienced gladiators to fight until first slice, rather than to the death. A trained gladiator represented a sizable investment, and their heavy diet of barley, wheat, fruit, vegetables, and beans was designed to give them a layer of fat that would help them to survive flesh wounds. What is more surprising is that Flamma was offered his freedom 4 times during his career, and each time refused. This was done by giving the gladiator a wooden sword, or rudi, which signified his retirement. We can only guess at why he decided to keep fighting. There were not many opportunities for ex-gladiators, whereas a famous fighter would have been well fed and cared for and allowed to keep whatever money or gifts were bestowed on him. Many of those who retired would have ended up joining the legions or working as private bodyguards, where their fame and glory would soon be forgotten, as newer, more entertaining gladiators took to the arena. Gladiators held a slightly unusual status in Rome's deeply stratified society. Officially, they were considered slaves, the lowest of the low, who could be bought, sold, and treated however their owners saw fit. The reality, though, was more nuanced. Slaves throughout the empire sometimes became trusted servants who would ultimately be granted their freedom, becoming full Roman citizens, as was the case with the Stoic philosopher Epictetus. Even those gladiators who were never formally freed were granted special privileges, such as the right to get married. While the vast majority of those who fought in the arena died in obscurity, those who proved themselves could rise to a celebrity that rivaled politicians, generals, and even emperors. Ridley Scott's epic movie Gladiator is littered with historical inaccuracies and anachronisms. The catapults and flaming darts seen in the opening sequence may have been used in sieges, but never in open battle. The Emperor Marcus Aurelius did not ban gladiatorial games, but in fact promoted them in a bid to distract the public from a bad economy. There is also no evidence that he, or even the Senate, wanted Rome to return to being a republic. And the central character, Maximus Decimus Meridius, played by Russell Crowe, is entirely fictional. Nonetheless, the film does offer a vivid and visceral impression of life in first-century Rome, and Flamma may well have been among a number of real historical figures who were the inspiration for Maximus. While he was from Syria, not Spain, and was almost certainly not a Roman general, he was a secutor who began his career in the provinces and went on to delight the crowds at the Colosseum with a string of impressive victories before dying a hero's death in the arena. The real Emperor Commodus, who is the arch-villain of the film, is described in some contemporary sources as a violent and arrogant ruler who had 600 concubines, both women and boys, and regularly slaughtered men and exotic animals in gladiatorial combat, smearing himself with the blood of his victims. This is probably an exaggeration, but we do know that he did dress up as a gladiator and fight in the arena, although only with a wooden sword. He also renamed Rome Colonia Commodiana, literally the colony of Commoduses, after himself, and changed all the months of the year to reflect his titles. Unsurprisingly, he had a lot of enemies, although he was not killed in public by a famous gladiator, but having survived numerous assassination attempts, was finally strangled in the bath by his wrestling instructor in 192 AD. All that remains of Flamma today is a faded gravestone in Sicily, which according to its inscription was paid for by his friend and fellow gladiator Delicatus. A few brief words outline a remarkable life that still resonates through the centuries. We do not know if he died in combat or from some illness. We do not know if he had a wife or children, and we know nothing of the many men he must have slain. But we are given a glimpse into the story of a man who rose from obscurity to great fame through his own skill and showmanship, who stared down death regularly and turned down freedom each time it was offered. Is it any wonder that this worn-down piece of stone continues to inspire and fascinate us to this day? If you like this video, you'll love the books. Check them out on Amazon by searching up Scott Matthews.